Hi, my name is Lisa Martin. I am the mother of a child with special needs. He has Fragile X syndrome. In many respects, he has been my teacher. He has made me be a more caring, compassionate, better human being. What we have learned together on our journey, I have realised the difficulties and challenges that parents of special needs children face are wide and varied. During my years of facilitating courses for parents and professionals, I have met some wonderful people who have shared with me their stories of great joy and sadness, who have experienced the good, the bad and the ugly of all aspects of life bringing up their special children. I am passionate about empowering parents who are dedicated in helping their children with additional needs. You're invited to my podcast. I will be talking about all things in our special world of disability and additional needs. I will be interviewing other parents of children with special needs, as well as professionals and people in the community who are offering services that help. Sometimes these podcasts might touch an emotional nerve and upset you. Other times they might fill you with joy and empower you. I don't mean to make you angry or upset, but we need to get a wider audience listening and talking about disability. Only when this happens, I believe disability won't be feared as it is today. Hello, my name is Lisa Martin, and I would like to introduce Becky Hardiman, who was a researcher, and she was researching Fragile X syndrome, and now she's the CEO for the Fragile X Society in the UK.
Hi, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, welcome. So my child has Fragile X syndrome, and I just thought it would be really powerful to get some more information out there about Fragile X and what it is and what you guys do.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to be able to come and chat a bit about the condition and the charity too, and how we might be able to help some people that might be listening.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think we should maybe start with your story and how we got into working for the Fragile X Society, because everyone in the Fragile X community, me being one of them, absolutely love you.
Oh, I'm very grateful. It was a bit of an accidental journey really into Fragile X. I was studying psychology, and during my undergraduate degree was really fortunate to do some research with Professor Chris Oliver in Birmingham, and met people like Kat Ellis, who you interviewed previously, and it's a really strong department looking at behaviour in people with genetic syndromes and understanding rare genetic conditions, and I just thought it was absolutely fascinating, and I really wanted to pursue research looking more into these issues, and I had sort of an interest in autism and learning disability, so it all came together really nicely. So I was looking around for places to study for a PhD, and came across Professor Peter McGill in Kent, who, with a former PhD student, had been looking at behaviour in boys with Fragile X syndrome, and trying to understand sort of patterns of environmental environmental influences on behaviour, and specifically sort of realising that there are differences in how behaviours might be learnt and what motivates people between different conditions.
Wow.
It's a bit niche. But what really interested me was that this intersection between like biology and behaviour, as well as the external sort of influences, and so we
talk a lot about hyperarousal with Fragile X children, and my child Iggy has got lots of hyperarousal, so I have a sensory diet in place for Iggy, which is about movements that calm, and also movements that can motivate, having time out and looking at his anxiety.
Which is so important. And so what we were looking at in the PhD was how, for people with Fragile X, their sort of stress-related systems, the fight and flight and your sort of cortisol responses are probably a bit turned up. And so, what you or I might experience as being only a little bit stressful, sort of physically, people with Fragile X might be having this really overwhelming response. So that's kind of what we were researching. And but at the time when I started the PhD, I hadn't met anyone with Fragile X before, and I really believed that, you know, it needed to be that I was more than just an external researcher. I wanted to really be part of the community, get involved, support wherever I could. So ended up just popping along to one of the Fragile X Society, which is the national support charity. Popped along to one of their annual conferences and was selling some Christmas cards.
Yeah, you started off volunteering, didn't you?
Was just doing little bits of volunteering where I could. And from there, started volunteering in a more in-depth capacity as a trustee of the charity. So helping to set strategy, and I was sort of using my research background and the knowledge I had of Fragile X to try and contribute there. And then a little further down the line, the opportunity came up to, the vacancy to lead the charity came up, which was really exciting to me, but also quite terrifying. But I was really fortunate to be selected for the post. And then from there was balancing doing research with leading the charity, which was great fun.
Yeah, and we're very, very lucky to have you, because you have been really wonderful for all the families. You are. Yeah, so that's great. So let's talk a little bit about what is Fragile X and how does it present itself. So you touched on that with the hyperarousal and the anxiety, because it can look a bit different with boys and girls as well, can't it?
Yeah, so Fragile X is an inherited genetic condition, and lots of people are really surprised to learn that it's the most common inherited cause of learning disability. There's about 1 in 4,000 boys and men and about 1 in 6,000 girls and women have it. But people will often go undiagnosed or sort of get alternative diagnoses like, kind of generally learning disability or generally autism. But the way that Fragile X presents does vary quite a lot between individuals, but there are some things that are more likely to occur with people with Fragile X. So as we've mentioned, anxiety is a really big thing, and sort of one of the number one things I'd want someone to know when someone's working with Fragile X. But there's varying degrees of learning disability and sort of a pattern of learning styles as well that are really important to learn to support children in the classroom, as best as possible. But also there's some health conditions, like people might have epilepsy, loose connective tissue that can have all sorts of impacts, both with being hyperflexible, which is not always an issue, but it can be, and also maybe some digestive problems as well. So I think it's really vital to get that diagnosis to understand all these different impacts that it might be having for that individual. And you mentioned a bit about girls and boys, and that's the myth that I always try to tackle, because Fragile X was always seen as this boys' condition because boys and men tend to have more clear effects of Fragile X. It's because of the sort of sex chromosomes, but basically girls have 2 X chromosomes, so when they have Fragile X, typically only one of those is affected, so their other X can sort of variably help to compensate for that. So on average, girls and women are less clearly affected, but that in itself can bring a lot of challenges. So a lot of the girls and women we work with, might have sort of subtle but quite impactful effects of having Fragile X, and might fall through the cracks in systems a little bit because, they have significant, have things that are really impacting on their day-to-day life, but might not be being picked up or recognised because, a bit like in girls and women with autism, might be quite good at masking that. But also too, you can have girls and women who have quite severe effects of Fragile X as well, and they can quite often get overlooked because people assume that girls and women are only mildly affected, and that's a myth that
it is a myth, isn't it? Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you've cleared that up, because I think you're right. As well as in the autistic community, lots of girls get overlooked, and I'm coming across parents who are getting their children diagnosed and also going through the diagnosis themselves.
Yeah,
because,
absolutely.
they're a mum and they masked. The ideas of masking. So that is interesting. Yeah.
And then it's an inherited genetic condition, and one of the crucial things to know about Fragile X is that it can be picked up via a blood test. So it's a sort of concrete thing that can be tested for, and so that's a big thing that we do at the Society, is to try and raise awareness of the fact that, you know, you can get tested for this, and also the sort of value of having a diagnosis like Fragile X, because Fragile X is not just a label that gets put on someone. Any genetic diagnosis is not meant to be another label for people in a world that is already trying to label them left, right and centre. What I always try to say is, once you've got that diagnosis, it's a toolkit of information where you can, it gives you access to strategies about things that may happen, may give you explanations for things that are already happening, but also direct you to strategies that can help. And what we always say is that, you know, sometimes when you get a diagnosis, you can hit Google and get a list of all of these scary sounding characteristics. But really, if you see it as a toolkit, if someone is experiencing those characteristics, it gives you additional information. But not everyone with Fragile X is going to have every feature. Some people might have lots of features of it, but it's just empowering you with that knowledge once you have the diagnosis.
It's good that you said that, actually, because it took me over 2 years to get Iggy's diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome. He was diagnosed, he was assessed twice for autism, and it came back negative. He wasn't autistic, even though now he has had a diagnosis of autism later on, because he's 9 now. And I think one of their main reasons was because Iggy hasn't got the facial features or some of the features that could be more obvious. And I think that was probably why.
I think that's still a big misunderstanding around genetic conditions, is that there are some facial features associated with Fragile X. Like, some people might have a slightly longer face, or slightly larger, or sort of more protruding ears, and there are some other physical characteristics as well. But what I try to say is that, you know, some people will very clearly, you know, you'll see, and it's quite clear that they do have Fragile X from their appearance, but it's not, you can't diagnose based on appearance. And there is, you know, there's also people just in all walks of life that may have slightly larger ears or a longer face. Exactly. It's not, you know, you can't pick someone out specifically for having it. And I think that can lead to delays as well, because there are some conditions, you know, Down syndrome is a kind of classic example where typically you can see it immediately. But I think that, you know, people with Fragile X, quite often you can't tell from seeing them, and that sometimes can cause challenges as well, because people might not realise why someone's behaving a little bit differently, and it can cause
the hidden disability and being judged by Joe Public.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can say that from experience, because, you know, I have a child with Fragile X syndrome, and some of the awful comments we've had in the past, you know, just because he doesn't look like he's got Fragile X syndrome or a disability.
No, just he is a sort of typical child in many ways, and, you know, has some additional needs. But I think that's something that in society in general we're not fantastic about. Is, you know, people always report to us about getting looks and when out in public. But
something really great that you said earlier was one of the questions you get asked a lot is, you know, why is it so important to have the condition-specific exist, which you've explained a little bit about. But something lovely that you said was, and I know from my experience being the parent of having to explain Fragile X to the GP, because many of them haven't heard, then it's to the school, and then it's to everybody, because not many people understand what Fragile X is. But then you said it's the one place that all of us can get together and we don't have to explain our children and what Fragile X is. And that's really important.
Absolutely. So the Fragile X Society was started in the early 90s by parents who had children with Fragile X. And at the time it was thought to be ultra rare. So it was a small number of families who got together. And then quite quickly it became apparent that it's actually much more common than originally thought. And so the charity's now grown to being a community. We've got about 2,000 member families. And But yeah, sometimes we're a small national charity, and it can be quite tough out there for small charities. But I do think there's such value in being that community, a central point of contact that really gets the condition, kind of gets that it's learning disability but some extra things, and gets that it's like autism but sometimes not, and also really understands the family-wide impacts of Fragile X as an inherited condition. People who are carriers might themselves also experience effects, or they might, and because it's inherited, there may be multiple children in the family or multiple relatives across families that have additional needs. And so I think having that specific support that really gets it is really vital.
The Fragile X Society has been absolutely vital in my world. And you do this amazing yearly conference that I think I've only missed one since I found out the diagnosis. But I can remember ringing you up first, and it was Wendy, who unfortunately she isn't working there anymore. But Wendy was amazing, and I can remember just crying and crying down the phone, and she said, "Come to the conference, you're going to meet other families." And I got so much out of that. Not feeling isolated, and it's so important to kind of meet other people that get it, that have kind of gone through your own experiences of life, with this entering this new special world, I suppose, the Fragile X world.
Absolutely. And I think it is really important, both physically at things like our conferences, but also online. We've got quite an active online community. I think there's so much value in sharing experiences with the general special needs community, but I think there's something specific about having that point of contact of other families that have the same condition as what you're going through, can share experiences, the really tough ones and the really positive ones,
the good, the bad and the ugly.
Absolutely. So we have these annual events, sometimes more frequently than annual. We do where we bring people together to meet each other and share experiences, but also to hear from professionals and researchers to get updates on what's happening in the Fragile X world more generally. And I think that's really crucial, and it's one of our key aims at the Society is to educate people, about research into Fragile X, promote research, and also to just educate about strategies and best practice that then can be worked out, help to benefit each individual. But as well as those events, we have a helpline, as you mentioned, that have our families and professionals advisors on the end of the phone. So there's Caroline, who takes calls relating to children, and Jane, who takes inquiries relating to adults. And we get all sorts of calls in, right from, as you mentioned, that oh my goodness, I've just got this diagnosis and I have no idea what it means for me and I'm really scared. Supporting people right from that first stage, and sometimes even before, when people are exploring, is this a diagnosis that might apply to me? But then right through people's lives with Fragile X, where people call us with specific issues around education, accessing services and social care, if there's a particular behavioural challenge or trying to find work. And sometimes I think we also have some people who call our helpline that are just, with that central point of contact where people aren't sure where to go, we can help direct them. And I think particularly in the Fragile X community, where anxiety is a really big challenge, both for people with Fragile X syndrome and some carriers, I think having that consistent support and you kind of know who you're going to get on the end of the phone, it's a reassuring voice to kind of help guide you. I'm super passionate about that part of what the charity does, and it's for that reason a real honour to be able to work for the charity, because you get to see day in, day out the impact that support has for people.
It really is important just knowing that I've got somewhere to ring, and there's always going to be someone there who can just deal with the good, the bad and the ugly. Because things happen, and quite often in my life with Iggy, sometimes I just think, all right, everything's running really smoothly, I've got this, I understand what's going on, and then someone pulls the rug from underneath my feet and something happens, like maybe behaviour at school, or a new teacher, or a new routine, or something always happens, or new paperwork needs to be filled out. And yeah, you're great at signposts, and you've really helped me. Really helped me, and I thank you for that.
No, it's our pleasure. It's what we're here for. And I think because we don't always, we're not doctors, or we don't have that clinical sort of input always, but what we can do is bounce ideas with you, give our thoughts on what may be happening, and then empower parents and people with Fragile X. We need to do better at that, but we can empower people with then resources that you can then take on to your professionals and help to back up what your experiences are, and advocate for strategies that may be able to best support yourself or that individual in that instance. So
it's really helped me whenever I've had things going on at the school. So as you know, I'm a great advocate for my child, and I'm constantly in and out of the school, and I've give little short lessons in hyperarousal and things like that, and it's always been backed up from the paperwork that you guys have sent me in the post. Definitely. Because it's one thing being a parent who's advocating for your child, which is really important, but to have that backup from the Fragile X Society, or whatever society it is, whatever condition your child's got, I think it backs it up, doesn't it, from what you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. And the themes that I'm bringing up relation specifically to the Fragile X community will apply to, there's lots of fantastic syndrome-specific charities or condition-specific charities out there. And it is, there's a lot of shared purpose there. And I think the messages are starting to get out there about the importance of understanding specific conditions and the value that has for each individual. You mentioned earlier about some of the challenges with accessing diagnoses, but there are really fantastic organisations like Medics for Rare Diseases that are out there now that are right from medical students, right from the early stages of their training, trying to get them to think about rare and genetic conditions. And it makes me feel quite hopeful, hopefully, that these messages will start to get out there more. But in the meantime, we have to be proactive and help to empower our community to...
Research is so important, and like you say, being more specific is very, very important. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the differences between autism Fragile X, because this is something that people ask you all the time, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's a really tricky one, and there will be people within the community that have really differing views on it, and that's sort of okay. Yeah. So Fragile X has a lot of features associated with it that look a lot like autism. So people might find it quite difficult to make eye contact or avoid eye contact, particularly when meeting someone new or in sort of busy situations. There's nods happening.
I'm nodding because this is definitely Iggy.
And you might see a lot of repetitive behaviours like hand flapping or repetitive speech, and those are all things that sort of look like your kind of classic autism. But also there's the issue that when you start to look below the surface in Fragile X, those behaviours are really driven by that physical hyperarousal. So those stress systems, like I mentioned earlier, being really kind of primed to react. And there's some research out there to sort of show that the physical responses are different in people with Fragile X. And that leads to sort of anxiety that then leads to these behaviours. And that is absolutely, that happens for some people who have autism who don't have Fragile X too. But it does seem to be, these behaviours in Fragile X do seem to be particularly driven by hyperarousal. And so understanding Fragile X specifically kind of gives you that knowledge and specific strategies around managing hyperarousal that perhaps a general autism diagnosis wouldn't highlight so well. There's a lot of people who say that the autism diagnosis in Fragile X isn't especially helpful, that the Fragile X diagnosis will kind of tell you what you need to know to support that individual. But that's also balanced out with the fact that services are largely driven by autism diagnoses, and autism is very widely recognised now. So, you know, we have a lot of people who will push to get those autism diagnoses because it does give you access to services. But there is that debate about how useful and how meaningful autism diagnoses are in Fragile X. But in a kind of practical message, what we would say is that if you or your child has features of autism, then probably Fragile X and genetic conditions should be considered as part of that diagnostic process. It's we think about 2 to 5% of people who have autism actually have Fragile X as an underlying cause. So, you know, that's kind of up to 1 in 20. I think that's probably a bit of a high estimate, but you know, there's a lot of people who will have this general autism diagnosis, but actually having that specific diagnosis of Fragile X will help to empower them with more specific knowledge and help them to get the best support possible. But it's quite a nuanced discussion, and there are people, you know, you can find researchers and clinicians and families who have really differing views on how useful that kind of autism Fragile X link is.
I've been talking about this recently as well with other parents that I work with, and how the lingo changes with diagnoses and labels and things like that, and it's like a minefield out there, and it's very confusing for a lot of families, actually.
It absolutely is, and again, that's why one of the reasons we exist, so people can kind of bounce ideas off us, and we can help to then support that family. So, you know, if they wish to pursue exploring a diagnosis, you know, we can help to write letters of support for them to get that. And talking them through, because it is complex. You know, genetic syndromes, including Fragile X, can be hugely complicated. I think particularly Fragile X because it can have family-wide effects. You know, it's really, for us, I think it's putting information out there, but then letting people know that they can contact us to get that additional support and really help to unpick what that might mean for them as well, you know.
Because it is a really scary time when you're first given that diagnosis of something that you probably haven't ever heard of before. Because you have heard of autism, most people have heard of autism now, but they haven't heard of Fragile X syndrome. So you're straight, the point of call, go straight there first. So Fragile X is very complex, and it is genetic. So you've beautifully explained what Fragile X is and how it can look a bit different with a girl having Fragile X from a boy having Fragile X. But then there's the lots of pre-mutation challenges, isn't there, for the carriers as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned that Fragile X is inherited, and Fragile X syndrome can be inherited from people who are carriers, and basically what that means is they have a smaller change to their Fragile X gene than people with Fragile X syndrome do, and so people who are carriers kind of said that they have the pre-mutation. And it used to be that people who are carriers were considered to be completely unaffected, apart from the fact that they may pass Fragile X to future generations. But over time, it's become increasingly clear that that's not necessarily the case. So one of the first things that's realised, and I think it was a gathering of families in the States, one of the clinicians there had noticed that a couple of mums had come in to talk about their children, but had also mentioned that their dads, so the granddads in the family, had been experiencing some sort of tremors and some sort of degenerative conditions. And so at this conference, it was asked, you know, is anyone else in the room experiencing this? And hands went up everywhere. And then people started to clock, there's something going on here. And now we know there's a condition called FAXTAS, which is Fragile X associated tremor and ataxia syndrome. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. But basically what that means is that some people who are carriers, when they get older, might experience challenges with movement and memory and sort of balance problems, particularly tremor when they're trying to carry out actions, and ataxia, which is sort of problems with coordinating movement. And we're learning more about that now. But it's really crucial to know that this is happening too in families. And it may also be that women who are carriers experience primary ovarian insufficiency, which means that they might have early menopausal symptoms and maybe problems conceiving, or difficulties that come with the menopause at an earlier age. And there's an emerging sort of literature and emerging understanding of the fact that there might also be other sort of physical health symptoms that people who are carriers might have, like migraines, sort of pain and sort of neuropathy.
I'm nodding my head here, by the way, because I suffer massively from migraines, and I'm the carrier who's had a child with Fragile X syndrome, and I'm also concerned about my dad because I think he's been misdiagnosed of having the start of Parkinson's, which is shaken.
Yeah.
But he's the carrier. I'm a carrier because I've got it from my dad. So
absolutely.
So this is something that is a concern as well, because quite often the parents of children with Fragile X syndrome, which is quite challenging and it's tough at times, then end up having to look after their parents who are carriers as well.
Definitely. And I think that's one thing that's really important about having, a specific organisation that kind of gets Fragile X, because it isn't just one individual who may have some additional needs. There might be multiple children with Fragile X syndrome in the family, immediate and extended family, but also there's these carrier effects too. So quite often we'll be speaking with mums who they themselves might have some anxiety or have migraines or have issues going on personally, as well as supporting their children with additional needs and with their dads or who have these degenerative issues. So I think it's really important to take a holistic view of how Fragile X might be affecting a family. And that can really be quite scary, when you get the diagnosis. And I think we need to do a good job as an organisation about communicating about these things, and particularly the pre-mutation effects as well, that, these are things that may occur, but that understanding the fact that this is something that you may be at risk of should empower you to be able to seek support early if you are concerned about anything. But also particularly with the things like perhaps mental health challenges like anxiety and the physical health things, it's that it's not inevitable, and that if you do experience them, you can still seek support like other people with those same issues. It's not intractable because it may be linked with your genes, but what the primary message is to empower people with knowledge, so that they can seek the best support possible. But it is really difficult because, again, with that labelling thing, there's a real debate going on at the moment about the labelling of issues.
For me, I always think knowledge is power. Yeah. And, I'd like to be in the picture with anything that might happen, because I can concentrate more on my self-care and look into ways in supporting my own mental well-being and my physical health as well.
Yeah,
it's really important because there's lots of really good paperwork out there as well from America with vitamins and things like that, with the Fragile X Society over there. Well, they're not called the Fragile X Society.
They're the National Fragile X Foundation.
Yeah.
So it might be worth saying actually that we are part of the International Fragile X Alliance. So there are many countries that have their own specific support organisations, like the National Fragile X Foundation in the States. But there's also lots of countries that don't have their own support organisations. So we're part of both the international and the European networks, so that we can all best share resources to try and access people around the world who are accessing these diagnoses.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
It's so valuable. I mean, the value was really highlighted a while back where we had one of the other organisations there was a refugee family that had got in touch with them who had the diagnosis, and we were able to, as a community, source resources in Urdu for them. So we were, it's so valuable to work together and share best practice because, in the UK, we have a charity that's got a small number. We're a small team, but we have a staff team. But many of the organisations around the world are passionate parents who are, kind of advocating for their children and for their family members, and kind of, so we're all there to support each other and share.
Yeah, that's
best
brilliant.
practice.
Yeah, because I know there's lots of things going on in America. I think they get a lot more funding, don't they? And they have like Fragile X clinics, which I was amazed at.
They do. So a lot of their clinics are sort of virtual clinics, and it's a challenge that we need to address in the UK. In the UK, we do have we're working with a clinician up in Liverpool who, as part of her movement disorders clinic, can see people who are carriers, who have the pre-mutation, who are concerned about FACS tests. It's at the Walton Centre, and people can contact us at the Society if they want to know more information about that.
Oh, I didn't know about that.
So that's a fairly recent development, so I will have to fill you in about that. But yeah, in the UK, I think I'm a massive fan and advocate of the National Health Service, but it is a challenge as well that it means that people are less able to sort of select exactly where they want to go to get that specialist support. So currently we're kind of focusing on empowering individuals to be able to provide information to the medical professionals supporting them, but down the line, we'd love to have more clinical expertise about Fragile X in the UK. But yeah, in the States, they've done a great job of advocating at Congress and accessing funding there for Fragile X research. It's also facilitated by there being a large population in the States that then they can get good numbers for research projects and things.
Yeah.
But I think for the size of the UK, we've got a really active research community, which is great, doing all sorts of work, right from, I met a lovely guy who was doing computational neuroscience, looking at networks of brain activation in Fragile X, right up to like the team in Birmingham who are describing behaviours and looking into interventions, and then the team at the Patrick Wild Centre up in Scotland who do a really broad range of research, right from sort of animal basic research up to brain scanning and clinical trials. So it's really exciting that we have this community in the UK, but I think the clinical side of things, like the medical and sort of services speciality, as a way to go still.
Well, it sounds like I know from experience being a Fragile X family that we do need lots of support, with us being the parents, having a challenging child, but also having our own challenges as well. It's how do we go about this when all the cuts are happening, and it's tough out there, isn't it, for many SEN families, not just Fragile X families.
Absolutely. I think we support people with benefits claims and things, and that we would rather be supporting with the kind of practical day-to-day questions, but the reality is that a lot of the basic things that families need they're kind of having to battle for. One can try and be optimistic about where things might go in the future, but it can be challenging sometimes. I think there are some genuinely positive moves in society in general towards understanding and accepting difference. I think there's still a long way to go, and as an organisation as well, I think we have some way to go in. We've typically been a very parent-focused organisation. We were started by parents, and there's such value in that. But I also sort of hope for the future that we can better lift up and empower people who have Fragile X syndrome themselves, and have that kind of more, make sure their voices are heard directly too. I think it's a challenge being a national organisation, kind of how you work more directly with people, but it's certainly a challenge I think that as a society we need to do better at, but as a individual Fragile X society, we will get better at in the future too. So,
is there anything else you would like to add?
It's to say that genuinely, if anyone wants to know anything more about Fragile X, if you have a diagnosis, or even if you don't and you think that this is something that might apply to you, please get in touch with us. It's why we're here. You can email us. I don't know whether to give the address now, or we can put it so
you can do it now.
So it's info@fragilex.org.uk, or we're there on the end of the phone at 01371 875 100. There's also loads of information on our website, fragilex.org.uk, and you can find us on social media as well and get in touch through there. But really, it's just to say that we're here to support you, answer any questions you may have. I'm just really grateful to have the opportunity to come and speak, both to raise awareness of Fragile X and also the charity as well. And so thank you very much for having me along.
If anybody wants to donate anything to the Fragile X Society,
that would be
never turn it down.
That would be, as a small charity, it really is very tough out there, and in recent years it has been very difficult to keep running our services. So if people are moved by what we've been saying about our work, then please do consider supporting us. We are purely run based upon the generosity of individuals, and we also sometimes get support from trusts and foundations, but we don't get any kind of government funding or guaranteed funding. So I really appreciate that, because I really want the organisation to be there for years to come to support people through their lives, and I think it's so important. So
it's vital.
Yeah,
it's vital for families like me. We need all the money you've got. Thank you so much, Becky.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm sure we'll speak again and maybe do another podcast.
Sounds great.
Bye. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. To find out more about what I do, visit www.specialworldtraining.com and follow us on our Facebook page, Special World Training, Instagram and LinkedIn. I believe knowledge is power and strength is in numbers. And if more people get involved in our special world, we can all make our world a better place. Join me next week for more amazing stories from the good, the bad and the ugly.